Bizarre Reality Media. The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Our Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of deep conversational exploration into the fringes of social norms. I'm the one they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have Simon Esler of Free Thought Media. Join us for this engaging conversation as we explored a wide array of topics, from the intricacies of homeschooling and unschooling to the cultural dynamics of the Great Replacement Theory. Together, we'll dive into discussions on societal influences, cognitive conditioning, and the evolving landscape of education and family. This episode promises to challenge your perspectives and offer deep insights into the forces shaping our world today. But before we get into this fascinating conversation, we, of course, just have to do a couple of quick news and updates and front of house stuff. First and foremost, I wanted to float an idea past you guys, trying to grow and expand the Patreon. I was thinking of doing something where we do some bizarre town hall meetings, which would be live meetup / group discussions where, you know, people can bring things they want to discuss, or I can kind of formulate some possible things we can discuss. But basically, it'll just be like an online meetup for anybody that's involved in the Patreon. But if you guys think that might be something you might be interested in, let me know, and I could definitely start working on that. And that would definitely be something that I would offer for all the Patreon tiers, so anybody that's supporting the Patreon will have access to it. So I think it'll be a lot of fun. Hopefully you guys might be interested in it, but I'll need some feedback from you guys before I get that one rolling. And speaking of feedback, I am still running that free t-shirt giveaway. All you guys have to do to enter in that free t-shirt giveaway is fill out a quick 8-question survey, all your guys' thoughts and opinions pertaining to the show, all things that'll hopefully help the show grow and improve through this upcoming year. So if you guys don't mind taking an extra few moments to put some thought-provoking answers into it, I would definitely appreciate it. And at the end of the day, you might end up winning, again, any free t-shirt of your choice off of the Bizarre Reality Media merch store. And if you guys have been a long-time listener to the show, if you guys don't mind taking that extra couple moments to do it, you guys don't understand how much I would appreciate it. And moving on a little bit, if anybody is interested in catching the next live episode of Bizarre Inquiries, that'll be happening on December 4th at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time in the usual places, the Bizarre Reality Media, YouTube, Twitch, and Rumble channels. I know Rumble has been kind of flaky trying to get the live to work on that, but I should hopefully have that corrected. So by then, we should have the Rumble up and working as far as the live streams go. Moving on, if anyone is interested in being a guest on the show, sharing their experiences or encounters on the show, or contacting me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys could also call or text the Bizarre Reality Media hotline 24/7, and that number is 313-364-1551. And if you guys might be interested in supporting the show and all the hard work behind it, there are a couple of awesome ways that you guys can do so. First and foremost, you guys can go and check out the Patreon, as I was mentioning before, with 2 tiers available, ad-free / early access and full access. And with both of those, you have a 7-day free trial, so you guys can see what it's all about and see if you guys are interested and feel like sticking around. And if you guys do, I would more than appreciate it. Working on some new perks over there for those tiers, so there should be, again, some new stuff coming soon over there. And you guys could also go and check out the Bizarre Reality Media merch store with t-shirts, just $15.68 plus shipping, which altogether equals out to about $20, so about average for a shirt. And in the process of that, you guys can support the little guys, and people start picking up a little bit more on the merch store, then I'll make sure I start dropping some new designs over there for you guys. And if you guys want to, you guys can even donate to the show directly. If you guys find that it's worth value, you guys could donate through Cash App, Venmo, PayPal, anything you guys happen to use. No matter what it is, I greatly appreciate it. You guys can get me an energy drink to keep me up through the night so I can edit these episodes for you guys. Again, anything, any support, always appreciated. And last but not least, you guys can go and check out the affiliate links with some additional discounts and credits available for you guys. You guys can go check those out. I got Dimension Devices and Sticker Mule. $10 free credit over there for Sticker Mule. And I know times are tough out there, but if you guys would like to support the show in some other ways, one of the best ways that you guys can do that is by leaving a review or rating for the show on any podcatcher you guys happen to use. And of course, I will read on the show, give you guys a big shout out, because anything you guys do on that front is greatly appreciated. Also boosts the show up a little bit in the algorithms, makes it so more people are able to see the show. And in turn, I am able to get some more bigger, awesome guests on for you guys. And you guys can also go and follow the show on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. You guys could also share the show grassroots through word of mouth with friends, family, enemy, anybody that's around you that you think might be interested in the show. And you guys can also go and catch live shows and video content on the Bizarre Reality Media, YouTube, Twitch, and Rumble channels. And last but not least, you guys can also go and check out my other show that I do with my co-host Orin Felix over there, Bizarre Encounters with Shayn Orin, diving into a lot of the same stuff that we talk about on this show, but it's our research from our perspective. So a little bit different, but I think it might be another awesome show to get you guys through your work week. But every single thing that I mentioned is all available on the link tree, which is available down in that show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome to the show, content creator and filmmaker, Shayn Esler. How's it going today, man?
It's going all right. No complaints. Life is fascinating every day.
I guess that's putting it lightly, at least with all the craziness going on in the world, which is part of why I actually ended up getting in contact with you to have you come on the show. I always like to give a shout out to my buddy over there, Tom, at Strange Brew. Heard you have a conversation with him. Absolutely found it fascinating, talking about a lot of the stuff going on in our modern society. So, I figured it was about time that we'd have a conversation. So here we are.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to have another chance to share, what I'm passionate about with an audience and to try to bring some more situational awareness to what is going on.
So I guess for anybody that may not be familiar with who you are, what you do exactly, before we really start getting into the conversation here, why don't you let everybody know a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do?
Right. So, I've been in touch with conspiratorial materials and understandings for quite a long time. It's been a couple decades now. I think for me, I grew up with some interesting paranormal experiences that I think pushed me in the direction of questioning official narratives pretty early on. And so I ended up really studying a lot of interesting suppressed information about history, about power in the world. A lot of these really, I think, popular topics that since COVID, I think have become points of interest for many more people. But this was something that I was digging into quite early on. And so I ended up really deep in the ufology space for quite a few years based on some experiences that I've had. And I'll get to those later, I'm sure. But just to keep a broad overview, I ended up working within the ufology space, speaking at a few conferences, sharing my thoughts on metaphysics and ways of evolving the self according to what I experienced and what I'd studied. And that really pushed me towards becoming a content creator. Just from some of the conference work that I was doing, I was invited to come create some content and to, get into the space of syndicated content, of setting up a home studio. And I started out with more sort of metaphysical, hidden history, suppressed information. And then I moved into some comedy material. And this was all on a platform called Rise TV. And the material's still there, actually, on Rise TV. So I did a season of a show called Worlds Within. And that was the more suppressed information and history and metaphysics. And then I did some comedy content. I did a 1-hour comedy special and a 6-episode sci-fi sketch comedy special on there as well. And all of that is really related to, my work as an actor. I work pretty consistently on stage. I do comedy theater here in Toronto at least once a week. And, it's been kind of a winding path. I've also worked as an ordained minister and a personal support worker. And I guess life has brought me to a very broad understanding of our current situation. And so through all of this, I've been a student of warfare and really looked to study modern warfare and how that's evolved. And that's helped me frame my worldview as to a lot of the madness going on. I think a lot of the sort of satanic inversions that we see in our culture and bizarre things like that. So I'm now unschooling my 2 children. They've never been in a public school. We're a very close family, very sovereign family. And I'm really trying to live my life in terms of content creation, but also in terms of parenting, according to how I understand the world at large and the kind of, enemies humanity is faced with right now.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the aspect with the kids too, because I'm one of the people that also does the same thing. I homeschool my kids. I try to get them away from that public school system. And for people in our community, it's something that it's kind of like a pat on the back, like if you're able to do it, like that's awesome. More power to you. You can get them away from the indoctrination. Yeah. But, it's one thing that when you're one of those parents, from a lot of other people in the family, you end up getting a lot of scrutiny. You get a lot of people telling you like, yo, you need to put your kids in public school because they need to socialize. They need to do this and they need to do that. And, at least from my perspective, the socialization that they end up getting in these public schools is more than anything like materialism because, they get taught if they don't have the coolest shoes or they don't have this or they don't have that or they don't fit in with the rest of the group that they're going to be pushed out. So they need to learn how to conform, be part of the rest of the group. So in turn, they end up like not really being themselves and they lose touch of themselves and they get pushed into this rat race and this mind manipulation. But people can't see that from that outside perspective. Like I'm sure that you battle with this, but for all the parents out there that are able to do it, man, more power to you. And you got to keep it up and push past all the people that don't understand your perspective of things.
Absolutely. It is worth fighting for in every single way. There are few things we can do that are more powerful than, making that homeschooling choice, keeping your children close, becoming their primary influence during the most consequential years of their life, of their development. It's so, so important. And I, of course, also experienced pushback in my family and lots of resistance and judgment, and also have faced my own conditioning, moments where I had to let go of my conditioning, my idea of what schooling should mean as I started to really understand my children more deeply. And rather than making it about imposing a curriculum on them, getting to know them well enough to guide them according to who they are specifically, I really had to let some conditioning go in myself. And so now, anytime I see resistance or, I have people challenging what we're doing, I try to remember those parts of myself that I've had to let go of, that I've had to condition out of myself in terms of how I respond to the people around me to help them better understand what we're really up to. Because it's the freedom, the capability of the child in terms of free thought that I think is one of the things we're protecting most powerfully. And there is no better way to protect a child's capacity for free thinking than to homeschool them, in my opinion.
Oh, yeah, I completely agree. Like a lot of people that are around my kids, they have this issue with them that they always ask why, or they want to know the reason why things are happening. And for, like the older generation, they just want the kids to be quiet and not do that. Like my dad gets kind of irritated with them because every time he asks them to do something that doesn't make sense to them, they question it. But he doesn't understand that perspective, that that's exactly how I wanted to raise my kids. If something doesn't make sense, then question it. Don't fall into the perspective of everybody else. Don't fall into the ruts that everybody else falls into. If something doesn't make sense to you, then don't follow it. And learn how to do your own research and figure it out for yourself. Like, that's part of problem solving. I don't think a lot of people get that, is if people ask constant questions, it's not because they're an annoying person. It's because they're problem solvers and they're trying to understand things. And once you're able to understand things, then you're able to have pattern recognition, and then you're able to guess these things that are going to happen in the future, and also be able to react to things as they're coming versus people that only know how to do things because of a process. Like, it's a totally different way of thinking, but people who aren't part of that indoctrination, or who are part of the indoctrination, don't understand how that type of mind works. So rather they just try to suppress it, and they think that it's just an annoyance more than anything, which to me at least, like I said, I don't care how annoyed he gets. Like, that's exactly how I'm personally raising my kids, or anybody. Like, I want them to be able to question every single thing around them, because at the end of the day, that's the only way that you're ever going to be able to really be able to understand the world around you, is if you have the ability to ask why if something doesn't make sense.
You're so right.
Hold on tight, guys. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to the show.
There is constant pressure around children to sacrifice who they are to conform. And if we encourage them to do this enough early on, it really does break and suppress a part of who they are in a way that's, I think, very, very, very dangerous. I think it was normalized, deeply normalized in our society for many, many generations. I think we're at a time now where we can raise children that are free-minded and sovereign in who they are, but it is going to challenge a lot of what has been, and showing our children what it's like to be aware of conditioning and to make choices, knowing that we are beings that can just be conditioned easily. I don't lie to my children about that. They understand that we are vulnerable to conditioning no matter what we do. So for example, I'll give you guys a really clear example. The other day, I was going to put just like a fireplace video on our TV downstairs. It had started snowing, and I was going to put this cozy fireplace video on just for fun. And I was going to put it on YouTube, and an ad popped up. And I just sort of have this habit, because of who I am, how I've, grown up myself, of muting commercials. I just, by default, I don't watch a commercial. And sometimes I may allow myself to, but I'm very intentional about what I consume. I don't just consume anything that's in front of me. Just because it comes on, it's not an automatic to me that I'm then going to watch that commercial. But my son didn't understand, my 7-year-old son, he didn't understand why I was muting it and doing something else and giving my energy to something else while the commercial played. He was asking, like, why aren't you watching the commercial? And it really made me think about it. And I really had to answer him honestly that, our consumption of everything has to be so intentional. And we are constantly surrounded by different influences begging us to consume, to take in. And we can just say no. We don't have to constantly allow everything to come into us in that way. But I had to break it down to him in a way. This is one of the best things about parenting, is that it causes you to think in very simple, direct terms so that you can get information, wisdom to the child in a way that's accessible to them. And it was the first time I'd thought about that. But this intentional habit I've developed to make sure that I don't ever just blindly consume something, I think is something that I learned because I knew how vulnerable I just am as a human. Over time, I recognized how easily I can be conditioned like everyone else. And that if I want to avoid, different forms of programming and conditioning that don't serve me, it all has to be pretty darn intentional.
Oh yeah, 100%. When it comes to commercials too, it's one of those things that people don't realize, that you get these apps and they're free, but the reason that they're free is because you become the product at that point. The whole reason why these apps are free and they're full of ads is because they intentionally want you to watch the ads. And it becomes this thing where people have been so programmed into watching ads since the dawn of TV, since listening to radio, all of this stuff, that, it's a weird thing, like you kind of mentioned, when somebody actually like turns it off and doesn't actually pay attention to the ads. Like, I've always been one of those people that as soon as the ad comes on, I get up, I walk around the room, I go do something else I need to do, and I kind of use the cue for when it gets quieter again to know that the show came back on. But say, just breaking yourself away from that, people don't realize it, but if you're constantly being bombarded with these ads, you may not think about it subconsciously or consciously, but on a subconscious level, the next time you're at the store, for example, and you're like, oh, I really need this thing, or I have, this sounds like it might be something that sounds really good to eat right now. It's all something that's been subconsciously programmed into your head, that it pops up with different cues. Like within these ads, people don't realize they'll use certain color flashes, they'll use certain images in the background, they'll flash it a certain particular way. So then it initiates these cues where when you're at the store, when you're out about somewhere, you'll see this flash, you'll see this thing, and then it'll cue it back in your mind, and you'll connect it, and you won't really understand why you connected it. So if you're aware of these things, you can kind of break yourself away from them. But if you're not aware of them, then you're constantly being manipulated subconsciously to buy products, to do specific things, to feel certain ways. And it even goes beyond ads. I mean, just the algorithms and everything that you see on social media, all of that stuff, it pushes people to think a particular way. That's why, if you have your, a black friend, or you have a white friend, or you have an Asian friend, all of you guys have different ad feeds. And a lot of the time it's pushing hate towards the other groups. Like, it's all subconscious programming. And even if you're not watching those videos, if you're being bombarded with them constantly on your newsfeed, it's still planting a seed subconsciously.
Yeah, this is why I am such an avid student of warfare, of just understanding warfare and specifically the evolution of warfare. So, when they talk about the study of warfare and its evolution, it's discussed in generations. And, over the years, war has obviously changed drastically. It began with just groups of humans with spears, going at each other. And war has had this habit of always evolving along the lines of human technology. And so as technology evolves, so does war. And living in today's age of influence, specifically influence from the digital realm, we're dealing with technology that enables access to human cognition on an unprecedented level. And that's centralized access, meaning one source can access the cognition of many people instantly. And so if you consider the vulnerabilities that, we were just speaking to, war evolving into this digital domain where there is so much access to human cognition, it has evolved us into what's known as fifth generation warfare. And this is really a generation of warfare where instead of war being fought over land and the leadership of nations, the most prized possession, the territory that is fought for, is human cognition. And so now we live in this age where our vulnerabilities are exploited because centralized access to our cognition is the apple, the apple in every warmonger's eye. It's totally shifted the life that we're living. And that is, there is proper warfare ongoing. There are sophisticated psychological operations being waged between nations that fit right into our daily lives, that exist within our culture. And yet they are potentially tied to fifth generation warfare operations from, both domestic and foreign threats. And that is on top of the fact that our culture thrives off this technology. And so even basic, like we said, advertising is also using the digital domain and the cognitive battlefield really to operate on you in other ways. And so I find this insight very helpful because it beckons you to have the kind of situational awareness that you need for today, for this specific age of influence, so that you can proceed while protecting your capacity to think freely.
Say you're even getting tricked even within like political ads, for example, because I'm just going to use this one as an example. But when Trump was running, for example, they were running these ads where they were Republicans against Trump. But when you actually start following back into that group, you realize that it's actually a Democrat-run group. So people are getting tricked into thinking that Republicans are against this particular person when it's never actually Republicans in the first place. It's actually Democrats if you actually follow the group back. And a lot of this stuff is like that this idea gets pushed from one perspective and you don't realize why it's actually getting pushed. Like, a lot of the stuff with like cigarettes, for example, they'll push this thing where they'll say like, oh, vaping's bad because they want to push people towards cigarettes. So they'll push things saying cigarettes are bad to push people towards using another particular product. Like they're always psychologically tricking somebody into thinking that this thing is going to be better than this thing. So it pushes people in that direction. It's almost like this idea of like sheep herding, that you use that for people's minds to be able to push them into certain groups or to be able to push them away from certain groups or to push them into this whole idea of this age of chaos, which is what I think that, a lot of people are kind of theorizing that we're in now, that it seems like for a long time, most arguments were two-sided. And now we've gotten to a point that within that argument, there's factions where there's sides within sides within sides within sides that makes it so that each group is fighting within each group. And while all of this is happening, they're constantly getting bombarded with this information saying, this group is bad, this group is bad, this group is bad, this person did this person did this. We're getting to a point where everybody's getting whiplash so hard between, everything that's happening in the media, everything that's happening on the internet, and they think that it's all going to correlate in their everyday life. And, there are certain situations where, yes, these certain things will correlate, but for the most part, a lot of the things that you're getting tricked into fearing are things that you're not dealing with on a regular basis. But now you're living in this high-end state of fear where if any situation happens, you're going to be quick to jump and react. And you've been tricked into that, and people don't tend to realize that. Like, it's almost like they're inciting everybody to get into a point where they're just about to fight each other so that whenever they get to that point where they want to push down that last domino, everybody's going to start completely all-out fighting with each other.
It's just slowly setting it up piece by piece and keep continuously fracturing these groups into a point where everybody is just so divided that even within groups, people can't get along anymore.
You know, the best way to understand everything you just framed really is cognition. And, you know, I think giving people a way of comprehending cognition that is really clear, I think it helps map out the specific kind of madness you're describing and the level of influence. So when we look at human cognition, it's really broken down into some simple elements. We have attention, perception, memory, and thinking. This is the basics of it. And the main way in which human cognition is conditioned, is altered, in fact, what it sort of thrives upon and utilizes most is stories. We are narrative-based beings. And so most often what is conditioning us is a narrative. And, you know, that's a good way to comprehend the cognitive battle space. You're basically in a sea of narratives that are beckoning you. And when we are influenced by a narrative over and over again, your attention is being brought to that narrative again and again. And if it manages to influence you, if you become saturated by that narrative, what shifts is your perception. And so the attention being brought to a narrative over and over again can really alter the way you perceive. And once your perception has been altered by a narrative, then everything else follows. So the way that you think, you know, what you believe, the choices you make, and even your memory, the way you frame your memory can be altered by narrative conditioning. And this is just, again, it's part of our natural vulnerability as humans. Because we see the world through the lens of stories, because we are looking for stories, we have this tendency to be influenced by really powerful stories and by stories that have been put on repeat until they shift our perception. And so when you look at it through that lens of, okay, they're using stories to enter our cognition, and then from there they can manipulate our perception, then it's easy to understand exactly what you're talking about in terms of all these groups being fractured, you know, into these tribes that are then attacking each other. You know, one of the main ways they do that is by getting into your perception of each other, right? And meta perceptions. So how you perceive the other and how you think the other perceives you. And there's some great studies on this. There's a researcher named Emile Bruneau, and he studied, you know, perception and meta perception in the left and right wing political populations in the United States. And what he found was that the way they perceive each other is about 300% more extreme than the other really is. And we're looking at just from the lens of, you know, a normal sort of right-wing person and their left-wing neighbor. You know, we're not talking the most extreme examples that we see on like a libs of TikTok feed, you know, of the most unhinged. You know, that's a small group. You can get endless content of the most outrageous extremes, but you still have just kind of normal people who are your political opposition walking around in your neighborhood. They're just like you in many ways. But the way that the narratives that saturate our media have conditioned us to perceive the political other, as they found in this study, it's 300% more extreme. So the left-wing person, they believe their right-wing counterpart is an extremist, a violent extremist, actually. There's deep beliefs that everyone on the other side is violent. And the inverse is true as well. They found that the people on the right perceive their sort of everyday left-wing neighbor as having to be about 300 to 400% more violent than they actually are in their regular everyday lives. So the extent to which cognition is being infiltrated and then perception is shifted to cause the effect that you're talking about, it's very important to understand the mechanics of this, because to run operations like this, you know, that is what people are capable of doing. That is the aim of some of these influence operations. It is to enter your capacity to perceive and to manipulate it so that your perception of yourself and the other adheres to specific narratives that then drive your behavior. And then this gets into, you know, really the ability to do whatever you want with a nation, with a territory, because you can get its people to perceive reality the way you need them to perceive, so that they can actually request that their land or their territory is overtaken by you. They can facilitate it themselves because they will be at the behest of perceptions you engineered in the first place.
Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break, so stay tuned. And now back to the show.
So let me ask you this one. Considering that we've kind of been dancing around this topic, but it seems like it's something that'll definitely kind of fall in queue with this one. The whole idea of like great replacement theory. As far as like your perspective, because I know you're in Canada, I'm in the US, and it seems to also be something that's happening over in Europe. Depending on the area you're in, you're definitely starting to see these things happen. But on the other side, I definitely think that the internet narrative is also spinning it into something even bigger than it actually is. But again, not denying the fact that it's actually happening, but at least from like your perspective, what do you think is, one, the idea behind this great replacement theory, why you think they might potentially be doing it, and two, if you think there is validity to it, or if you think it might just be something that is continuously pushed as a narrative through the internet and through different forms of media?
So my understanding is that there is a group. We are dealing with a group of, frankly, potentially psychopathic people, but a group of people that are transnational. They don't believe in nationhood as a valid way of organizing the world, and they are seeking to create a new world order. They are seeking to reorder power in the world so that nation states lose sovereignty and are then absorbed into supranational globalist institutions, so that there is a governance occurring, governance for the world itself, and power is even more centralized into world governance. There are genuine enemies in the world using fifth generation warfare to seek that end. So some of the tactics being utilized by this centralized group of elite psychopaths is the flooding of Western nations with mass immigration. And this is very obvious for people to see. You don't have to be conspiratorial. You can easily see that Canada and America and the UK and Ireland and Scotland and all these nations are all being flooded with mass amounts of immigrants at the exact same time. Now, is it a coincidence that all these nations are all dealing with that same issue? I don't think so. I think it's more likely that it's an operation, because it's not something that has occurred through the democratic process. There wasn't any clear democratic process that allowed that to occur. A lot of that was organized at the level of entities like the United Nations, who are looking, to push a certain agenda. You have the World Economic Forum, who will frame things like mass immigration into a nation like Canada or America in very benign ways. If you go watch some of the World Economic Forum footage, they'll say that it's just because of labor shortage. And they'll just present it in this really bizarre, benign narrative of, there's a labor shortage in the West, so we're just going to take, 1 billion Indian people and put them there. And they keep that benign narrative ongoing, while the actual result of that is, of course, deeply cultural. Okay, so when you have a nation flooded with people from another culture, to the extent that those new immigrants do not need to accept being conditioned by the culture of that nation, whether it's the UK or America or Canada, they are able to arrive in a way that completely rejects any sense of nationhood, to the extent that their culture becomes a force that can clash with the existing culture. And to me, and to my understanding, that clash is intentional. And it's intentional for a number of reasons. So to flood a nation with people who come from a different background, number one, there's just a level of like religion, let's say. You have contradictory religions. But then if you look a little bit deeper, that means you might be dealing with different moral frameworks. Very, very deeply, deeply different moral frameworks could be clashing. This is going to cause a lot of tension. Now, these entities like the UN and the World Economic Forum, they propagate a narrative that is a neo-Marxist narrative. So it's based on identity, power, and oppression. And this is the evolution of Marxism into a focus on culture. So we're dealing with a cultural form of Marxism. And the way that it's being pushed at this supranational level by these globalist entities is through things like ESG scoring. Okay, so this is where corporations have to participate in this form of neo-Marxism by framing everything through the lens of power, identity, and oppression. So this narrative, it relies on the idea that there are all these minority groups that are oppressed by the system itself, right? Systemic racism, okay? Systemic homophobia. They rely on this because they can then use things like ESG scoring to infiltrate a nation and to force a nation to begin to live according to this neo-Marxist narrative that says you have to look at everything through identity, power, and oppression. Everything has to be organized according to that lens, to that narrative. So an example of this would be what happened with Dylan Mulvaney and Bud Light putting out the Dylan Mulvaney content and not blowing up, right? They were doing that to try to raise their ESG score. They were doing that to try to get their ESG score higher by uplifting an oppressed minority, by adhering to this neo-Marxist narrative. All of this is really important because when you go back to the mass immigration, you understand that they need more justification of these neo-Marxist narratives to then implement further radical policies that then allow control over a nation. So if they flood a nation with cultures that then clash and you have moral frameworks that are clashing, the natural outcome of that is a rise in racial tension. The natural outcome is a steady rise in racial tension. And anytime you're going to have a rise in racial tension, it is very easy to then frame that as a rise in the very racism that you've been claiming is systemically everywhere, which is why you need to actually score companies according to how anti-racist they are. You have to score companies according to how many transgender people they actually have in positions of governance. You have to score companies according to how much climate justice they're a part of creating. So not only do they have to participate in the climate change narrative, but they have to use the climate change narrative to uplift specific minorities. So the flooding of nations with, Indian people and Muslim people and anything but white people is, to me, to intentionally cause a kind of racial inflammation that is then used to further justify the neo-Marxist narratives that are the means by which they are overtaking nations and infiltrating their democracy. So that's one of the ways that I understand this all to be happening. The result of that is, most certainly, it is the erasure of specific people, of people that come from a more white lineage. But again, I would caution people in the sense that the racial framing, the idea that you need to see yourself through the lens of identity, oppression, and power is a neo-Marxist lens. So if you're looking at the great replacement theory through the idea of I identify as a white person and I am being systemically oppressed by what changes they are making to my nation, that is a neo-Marxist framing. And you have to be very careful not to participate in that while understanding all of these different moving parts and trying to defend who you are.
And I think that's one of the hardest parts, because the whole idea of equality, even to bring up some of these programs, if you specifically are picking these certain people that can check these certain boxes, that kind of contradicts the whole idea of equality to begin with, because the whole idea of equality would be to pick the person that is the most qualified for the job, no matter who they are, no matter what race they happen to be. So that would be, again, the true idea of equality. But when it comes to a lot of this stuff, I feel like a lot of people are getting really spun up about it, especially people in the conspiracy community. But it's intentional. Like, especially being in the conspiracy community, you have to understand that they purposely will push these things for the sake of psychological brainwashing, even within the community. So you kind of have to stand back and kind of view it from an outside perspective to try to understand like why they're specifically doing these things that they're doing and how they're able to affect you because of these certain things. Like, at least from the American perspective, I can speak on the mass immigration coming into the U.S. that it seems like it's primarily people that are from Islamic culture. And the reasoning behind that is because we've been so hard founded on a Christian nation that it is basically the ultimate opposite moral philosophy of us. So, of course, that's going to spin everything up. But, of course, from the sake of Canada and the sake of, Europe, for example, it seems like there's a lot of Indians that are getting flooded into those specific areas. For the sake of somebody that may not understand why specifically they chose that group and what the trigger points are that they might be trying to incite in your mind. Like, from your perspective, why do you think that it's specifically chosen that it seems to be Indians with Canada and Europe?
That's a good question. I can't say I'm very certain about that yet. I've been watching it very, very carefully here. There's contradictory things happening, and I'm still trying to sort out whether it is something that is backfiring for this globalist operation or if it's part of it. So I'll explain two different stories, and it'll give you a good sense as to why I'm watching this carefully and I'm still unsure. So this summer I really noticed in Toronto the huge uptick in the Indian population. It became very, very obvious. And there was one trip that I took to Toronto Island. And when you go to Toronto Island, there's Lake Ontario that people are sometimes swimming in. Sometimes the swimming conditions aren't great. People don't, but you can go there. And then there's a splash pad near a park. So there's different kinds of water that you can enter and play with. And then there's like a public fountain. And the public fountain, there are signs saying, please don't go in this water. This is not safe to swim. It's not clean to swim. It's not for swimming. And it rejected that. And for the first time in my life, I'd never seen this, but that the whole fountain had been flooded by Indian people, and they were all just playing in the fountain and completely disregarding what was going on in terms of signage and what was correct to use. And I just never seen that. But to me, it was obvious that this is one instance of that kind of deep cultural clash where you may be dealing with people who have come from a place in the world where they wouldn't even consider not going in a fountain. They would just potentially arrive as a large group and do it. I don't know, but I do understand there are some potential cultural differences there. And I can see how someone might be in Toronto and see that and get very racially inflamed. And I can understand that to a certain extent. On the other hand, we recently had a federal election, and I was watching the results of this federal election very closely. And while technically it was a liberal victory, I think there was some subversion of our democratic process, to be honest. But on the other hand, there was a shift towards a kind of populist conservatism in Canada that we've never seen. Massive, massive shift. And it didn't surprise me that Canada still hung on to the liberal side of things. Canada has always been more far left leaning. It was never going to totally flip the way the United States did. Our story is different. So I think it was always going to be more gradual. But there was this huge shift in conservative votership in Canada in the most recent federal election. And there were a lot of groups that previously voted liberal or even further left, NDP, which is as far left as you can really go. And there were NDP pockets here in Toronto that flipped conservative. But one of the interesting stats I found was that immigrant families were flipping conservative in a massive way. And I thought this was pretty curious because I've heard a lot of narratives that nations are being flooded with immigrants to flip the votes. And if that's true in Canada, if that was the intent in Canada, then that has backfired to a great extent because the immigrant families are moving, right very quickly as a population. And so I have to wonder what the intent here is, I'm not sure why those nations were chosen, but they definitely have been. And I just have to withhold certainty and keep watching.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we kind of have the same thing that's happened in the U.S., that they thought that a lot of these groups of people that were previously, that are immigrants, were going to end up voting more left. And honestly, they ended up shifting right. And I think that the reason behind that is that a lot of the reason why a lot of these people came to Western culture was because they were trying to get away from that culture that they were previously in. You know, they didn't want the third world conditions. If you're talking about India, for example, they didn't want all the crime. They didn't want everything that was going on over there. So they came here to become part of this new culture. So when they see their old thing that they tried to escape come into these new areas, and they start bringing those old customs and cultures back, and they're almost seeing the thing that they tried to escape come back in this new area. I feel like those are going to be the first people that are going to fight against it. And ironically, you know, a lot of the people that are trying to push this stuff, I'm kind of curious if they knew that subconsciously, or if the initial intention was, you know, this is your group, you're going to end up voting for this group. I'm kind of curious if it was just I guess like a social shift that they weren't necessarily expecting. But I mean, if you look at the root of it, I mean, if you go to any country, the intention is that you want to take in that culture and you want to be part of that culture. If you go into a new country, a new group, and you bring in your culture, I mean, within your house, that's one thing, but you're breaking away from what that country was and why you even came there in the first place. Like, you know, we kind of have like a weird perspective being Western culture because we've always been this group that's supposed to be accepting of every single other group. But if we ever took our group, our culture into anywhere else in the world, you know, people aren't going to have an interest in that. They want nothing to do with that. So, you know, why do we hold ourselves over here in Western culture to a different standard? Like, you know, Japanese culture, this is something that I always like to bring up. That seems to be probably one of the most comparable cultures that seems to be able to get along with European culture for the most part. But even within that group, they even have specific areas that are just intended for people that are locals because they don't want these areas influenced by cultures from outside perspectives. Like, you know, we need to start kind of having that mentality in some areas of Western culture because, you know, we were originally the melting pot. And I mean, that is, you know, a good concept, but people don't understand this whole melting pot concept comes from European culture and European culture blending together, which definitely works. And it appears that, again, some cultures do have the ability to blend together very easily, but there are certain ones that the moral framework, as you mentioned earlier, is just so different that there is no possible way that they're ever going to be able to collaborate with each other unless one is willing to give up their complete culture to fall into the other one. And that's something you see even within, not, you know, everybody, you know, love who you're going to love, I guess, but even within biracial couples, essentially one of them gives up their cultural heritage to be part of the other one. Like, you know, some people might infer this as kind of like a racist idea, but that's not necessarily what it means. Like, you'd want somebody to understand your struggles, your perspective, your culture, and come up exactly how you were. Like, there's some old videos of Muhammad Ali even saying something along the lines of, somebody asked him if he'd be interested in a white girl. And he said, nothing wrong with white girls. You know, white girls are pretty, but I would rather have a black woman because she can understand my struggles and my perspective. But when you get into that situation, again, it's, no matter what way you look at it, one culture has to give up their culture in order for them to be able to collaborate together. Like, there's never this perfect blend of cultures. That just never seems to work like they theorize that it will.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And now back to that deep conversation you crave.
I think, you know, there's something to be said about legacy and about the way in which continuity of culture can create stable family legacies over many generations. And it's not that you can't do that when you are coming together as different cultures, but you might want to be much more intentional in terms of how you perceive the lineage that you're creating. What is being passed on from what culture to what? You know, what is the moral framework that is going to move through that lineage? I think generally as humans, we need to be thinking more multi-generationally. I think that is really important. And so whether you're part of a more cultural clashing family or whether you are, you know, seeking to be in a family line that has, you know, maybe racial or cultural continuity, it's not really racist to understand that people of a same race may maintain a certain continuity culturally that then allows you know, a lineage of wisdom, a lineage of understanding. That's a pretty normal thing in human existence, you know, and people have the power to make that choice or not to. But just in terms of understanding mechanisms by which traditions and wisdom are passed on, it's very easy to understand that continuity of culture gives a mechanism by which you can have a stable lineage of wisdom and, tradition and things that carry through. And I think that really is one of the most important things, not to create any kind of segregated society where we only have like singular races getting together, like nothing like that, but just this capacity to understand what you need to do, how you have to stabilize a lineage and make sure that you are protecting not just this generation, but 7 generations in the future, and really having that mindset. A lot of that does have to do with what kind of cultural, moral framework your family is composed of and how you're using that. This is not just important in terms of, how we live, living as strong families and creating a strong family line. It's important in terms of the war we're in, because this attempt at creating a new world order, a big part of their focus is the degradation of the family unit, is the destabilization of the family unit, so that there is not a capacity to generate a lineage of knowledge and wisdom and awareness. Because if you have families that are stable and can pass on knowledge and wisdom through the generations unimpeded, then that family line will not be a family line that relies on the government and the schooling system and the media to orient itself. That's not going to be a group of people that's reliant on that. So the more they break down the family unit and destabilize the family unit, the more they degrade our capacity to maintain a stable lineage and legacy of wisdom that is unreliant on their influence. So it's so important that people grasp that the family unit's being attacked, especially because a new world order cannot be established as long as there are stable families generation after generation.
That's one thing that I will throw into some of these cultures that we're referring to, that Western culture seems to be one of those cultures that families do not stick together, even in the capacity of generations living under the same roof. Maybe it's the materialistic aspect of Western culture that, for every time you split a family up, you have this group go over here, you have, brother, sister over here, over here, over here. That's just spreading out the bill. So now this household's paying water, this household's paying water, this household's paying water, this one's paying water, all of them are paying electricity, instead of all having everybody under the same roof and actually putting everything together. That's one of the one things that I will give about some of these other cultures, that I think that I wish that was something that we had in the U.S., because we've broken apart so much as a culture. And I don't know what generation you're in exactly, but it seems like the Gen X / a little bit older generation, they kind of have this extra separation where, a lot of like the 90s kids, 2000s kids, when they were little, their grandparents were regularly around them. They'd hang out with them, they'd watch them all the time. But for whatever reason, the generation that came after that, they had this separation where they thought they were going to get this whole like second childhood. They thought that, the second their kid turns 18, they're out. They have nothing to do with them. They only pop by when they need to. For whatever reason, like that generation seemed to have separate the whole family idea more than anything. And it seems like millennials, some of the Gen Xers, and Gen Zs are starting to actually try to bring this whole family group back together. And it's working on 2 levels. As we're getting to a point where things are getting so expensive, if we start actually being able to live in these groups, it's going to start reducing the bills and make everything a little bit easier for everybody. But I think it only has benefits realistically, that we need to push back towards keeping the nuclear family strong and stable, and stop detaching through generations and be detaching through, brother, sister, whatever, and spreading out into different households. Like, everybody try to stay together or stay as close knit as you possibly can for as long as you can, because it seems like once that family structure fractures, it never tends to go back exactly the same again.
There's been a huge loss of rites of passage within the family that I think is part of that. Intentional rites of passage that are created, within a family unit to help take the suffering of life and give it meaning, give it story, give it purpose. I think that's the role that rites of passage play. And when we don't have intentional rites of passage to orient the family and the family's movement through time and, the way the children grow and develop, when we lack that, then the kind of hollow rites of passage that are pushed on us by society, they become the default, they become the program, they become the norm. And I agree entirely that I think in previous generations, there was a kind of rite of passage of get your kids out of the house, that the best thing you can do is get them out of the house towards independence and, sort of separate them from the family. And that was somehow, the casting off of the child was this victory, and it was a necessary rite of passage, as opposed to the family that sticks together, that starts businesses together, that seeks to create, generational wealth together, that, I think is an entirely different mindset. And this idea that you have a ticking clock to get the kids out of the house as fast as possible, I think that was some programming, some cultural conditioning that really replaced intelligent rites of passage in terms of getting children into the world in a way that really serves their independence, but doesn't necessarily sever them from the family. Because why? I mean, unless that's correct for the child and that's a chapter they're moving into naturally, why is that the default? There's a lot of questions to be asked about that, if you ask me.
I mean, just kicking kids directly out of the house. I mean, whether you're an adult or not, when you're 18, you're 20, or whatever, a lot of the time they don't teach you these structures on how to keep yourself out of debt, how to be able to, keep track of your finances, how to do any of this type of stuff. So a lot of the time, it almost kind of seems like it's this intentional push them out to be able to create them into debt slaves. Because if you're existing still within your parents' household and you're able to get to a point where you're fully stable, and then maybe you take that step out, or you continue to build generational wealth, you possibly get some property and even build just different houses on the same property with your family, you're going to be better off than if you just end up pushing them off and, existing off on your own. Because as soon as you get into that and you don't understand the structure, the system that you're getting into, like I said, you just keep amounting more and more debt. And then you just have these multiple different groups that are all part of the same family. They just have these different piling up amounts of debt. And if they all would have stuck together and were able to actually put all of their funds into one place instead of having all their bills spread out, like I was mentioning earlier, then everybody would get ahead. But, they trick people into thinking that you have to be independent no matter what. You're not supposed to stick with family because that doesn't mean that you're independent, even though you can still fully have your independence and still exist around your family. But I think the main idea of pushing people into this is once you push people into debt slaves, then you got them for life, because they don't even realize that they're stuck under the system. Because once you start getting underneath the water of that debt, you're going to continuously work your entire life to try to get out, not realizing that you're never going to be able to fully get out of it. So it just pushes people into this constant cycle of, again, being debt/work slaves. I think that was the Western culture intention behind pushing people out, because it seems like the whole idea of pushing people out as the rite of passage happened around the same time as like the Industrial Revolution, where, when there was a lot more of these farm cultures, people stayed together as families. But as soon as these cities started building up and they started having these like Rockefeller type factories and everything, that's when the public schooling system started getting pushed. That's when all this independence of everybody living by themselves started getting pushed. So it all seems like it's part of the same structure, and it's all intended to push people into a point where you're essentially trapped by the system.
I think we're at a very interesting point in history, because there is something natural, there's something correct about a certain level of individualism that we're moving towards. I think that is the sovereign individual in terms of the capacity to think freely. And I think that's something that is emergent. I think we are moving out of eras of more collectivist, tribal thinking, where we let the collective think for us, where we let the tribe think for us, and now moving towards this ability to strike this very interesting balance between the sovereign individual learning to become sovereign and free in their thinking in a world of influence and all of this, but then also developing families that can stay together, remain stable over many generations, but do so without infringing upon the unique nature of the emergent individual. And I think this is something that families struggled with in the past. And I think it's part of that fracture is that the family unit, let's say when it was at the behest of religious dogma, was used to impose religious dogma on the child at the expense of their individuality, not as a means of giving them a moral framework to use as individuals, but just treating them like they are blank slates onto which dogma must be projected. And I think that mistake led to a lot of children needing to leave the family because their sovereignty, their individuality was not able to come to fruition. And so we have this interesting challenge now, I think, as parents. I think about this a lot, that I want to maintain this amount of family coherence and stability and freedom within my family, but I also don't want to squash my child's individuality. I want them to truly be who they are as unique individuals. And I think striking that balance, I really think we're at on a horizon. We're at the precipice of finding a kind of harmony and movement forward with the family that I think is really clear and very new and very beautiful.
Oh yeah, 100% agree. It's kind of like that idea that if you love something, you set it free, and if it comes back, that it was meant to be. It seems like that's kind of what happened with the idea of the family, that it was held so tight, so close for so long that it started getting to a point where it was oppressed. So it almost needed to break away for a while so that it could come back and become whole again, because sometimes you need to step away to find your individuality and then come back. But when you come back, now you can understand that journey to finding your individuality. So now, rather than suppressing the next generation, you can help them steer their way down that path of finding themselves and finding their own journey in life, and pushing them down the right path rather than just trying to sheep herd them down the path that you want them to go down.
This is why, as a family, we're big into unschooling, where, we're not really looking to copy the public curricula and give our children some version of that, or to even divide life into subjects. We personally don't really do that. We're very interested in following their individual passions and allowing them to make mistakes, big and small, on the way to figuring out what the heck they want to do with themselves, how they find meaning, how they find purpose, and really trusting that process. As I said earlier, that takes a lot of letting go, takes a lot of, just sort of releasing your own conditioning. But I think the result is pretty incredible. And we've never had an opportunity to let children find themselves this freely. I find it pretty exciting. It's why I'm so passionate about unschooling, because I've been able to see the results of it. And while it's been difficult in many ways, it's been a worthy sacrifice that I think more people could probably do than they realize. Trusting a child to discover what they need to discover, going through that, you start to realize how much programming is in you that basically states that children cannot learn unless they are manipulated by an adult, that they're incapable of learning without adult manipulation. And this is a very, very deep form of programming that's in a lot of us, and even rampant, I would say, in a lot of the homeschooling movement even. And, it's understandable to an extent, because I think that presumption was presented for so long. It's why when I look at the public schooling system today, yes, I understand that it's been weaponized, and that there's this cognitive warfare is in the schools, and they are manipulating children at the level of perception, and it is very Machiavellian. But even before that particular program was plugged into the schooling system, the system itself was already designed to squash the child's intrinsic desire to seek what interests them. That was built into the Prussian system as public schooling was imported here. And so it's important to separate that and to understand that, on top of the fact that the schools have gone woke, there's always been something in the schooling system, in its design, that was harmful to the child's ability to authentically stay on their own life path.
Inquiries About Reality will return after this quick commercial break. And we are back, so let's hop right in.
Say, I always like to give people at least somewhat of the steps that you can take to start actually taking an initiative for this type of stuff. So considering that you do home unschooling with your kids, a little bit different than homeschooling, if anybody was interested in taking some steps to possibly start doing this with their own kids or finding a place where they could possibly get some more information or community or anything like that, what are some of the first steps that people can take to start trying to do this type of stuff with their kids?
To be honest, really seeking out the communities is pretty easy now. Even just beginning to search like the word unschooling. I would also encourage people to be using the word life learning. There's also the term world schooling. So that's families that just use travel of the world as schooling and they do nothing but travel. I think going into those terms, even those search terms on Instagram and some of the mainstream platforms is a really great opportunity. I've written about it to a certain extent on my Substack. My partner Amanda has written about it on her Substack, I believe. And, I would encourage people to recognize that the most difficult part of unschooling, this is why I like the term unschooling, it's not because of what people think. Our children have never been in a public school. So it's not really that I'm unschooling them because they were never schooled. So I don't want people to be confused by that terminology. The unschooling aspect of it is in you, the parent. You're the one that has to be prepared to let go of your assumptions. Let me give people a story so they can understand one of these steps more practically. My eldest son, he's 10 years old now. We initially followed the sort of mainstream idea that we needed to teach him to read and to sit down with him, and to go and point the words out and read and show him and all this stuff. And immediately to him at a very young age, this was just total bullshit. He wasn't having any of it. And he was openly telling us, like, stop doing that. I don't want you to do that. And eventually we had to recognize that we had to just let him do it himself. And actually, we backed off. He ended up teaching himself to read. It was entirely his own process. Frankly, I don't even really know what he did. He just loved books and looked at books as often as he wanted and whatever books he wanted. And then it happened perfectly appropriately at age 7 or 8. He was good to go. And I had moments where I had to stop myself from being like, will you do some reading? Let's do some reading. And to try to like make it lessons and to, I had to let go of the pressure coming from family who were trying to say, why aren't you teaching him to read? Why aren't you sitting down to read with him? They were anxious about it. And they did not understand what we were doing by freeing him and letting him do it himself. And the result was very beautiful. Just recognizing that because it interested him, he taught himself. I had to let go a lot of nonsense that came up in me so that we could get to the point that would allow that to happen. So my advice to people would be observe what you're interfering with as a parent rather than interfering with what you're observing.
See, I can definitely agree with that.
It's backwards.
Say, at least for my daughter, I kind of had the same thing where, you kind of get, like you said, you get pushed into that normal indoctrination where you're trying to get them to read, you want them to do all this stuff, so you kind of push them down that path. But as soon as I let off, that's when all of a sudden she started flying through it. And my daughter, like every single night, she sits, she reads. Every time we drive in the car, she's sitting, she's reading. And I try to get her into that next step of making it into chapter books. And all I simply had to do was say, hey, you like those stories? Do you want stories that are more complex with more details? Chapter books are where it's at. All of a sudden, 2 weeks later, this girl's reading chapter books. So it's just a matter of trying to, it's almost like showing them that it's cool, and then they'll come to it when they're interested in it, type of a thing. Kind of like the same thing you were saying. They have these books that they want them to read, particularly for school, and my daughter was struggling with those when she was doing normal school. And as soon as she started doing the homeschooling stuff and she actually was able to read some of the books she was interested in, be it, history, whatever subject it was, all of a sudden, boom, she started flying through it. And I had the same kind of experience when I was a kid. It's a matter of certain brains work where it doesn't connect unless it's something that they're interested in. You can push information into somebody's head all day, day, but if they have no interest in it, it's going to be in one ear and out the other. And then on the other side of it, if it's something that somebody's interested in, they can hear something once or read something once, and then that's going to get stuck in their brain forever. And people need to realize that's how the brain works. Not everybody's intended to do everything. Certain people are really, really good at certain particular things, and you have to let them shine at that particular thing to figure out that that's the thing that they're really, really good at. Instead of making them a jack of all trades, if they want to become a master of one particular thing, you got to let them do that.
It's a hard thing for people to allow, I think, because you have a lot of anxiety about, trying to form your kid into this incredible being, and that the pressure is all on you, but you don't recognize how much of their own life path they brought with them, to be quite honest. And, again, I would point people to the cognitive lens, to the, understanding conditioning a bit better. In the schooling system, they are using bribes and threats. Okay. They're bribing you with an A, with a gold star, with whatever it is, and they're threatening you with an F, with failure. Okay. And that's called operant conditioning. Okay. This is a form of behavioral influence that really just believes that we're rats in a maze, that we don't even have souls, that we are just these rats that just respond to punishments and rewards. But the result of doing that to a child, this is pretty well understood in terms of studies. The result of constantly trying to manipulate a child through bribes and threats is that they lose touch with what they are interested in, their intrinsic desire. Okay. So what you are intrinsically interested in versus what is extrinsically what you're being told to be interested in, right? So the difference is, in the schooling system, they say, be interested in this and know this, and I will give you the gold star, the A. And if you're not interested in this, and if you don't know this, I will threaten you with the F, with the fail. And to manipulate children in that way, it does damage. It does damage to their ability to look inside and see, what am I actually interested in? What is right for me? What do I love? What do I want to follow? That specific form of manipulation, that is the result of it. That's the natural outcome. And I think understanding that, even if you have a kid in the system, knowing that there's so much you can do, but just comprehending that one of your goals is to protect their intrinsic desire to learn is really important. And the other thing I'll say, just to take it a little further, because I'm sure people, when they hear about this, they have lots of questions like, what do you just let the kids do whatever they want? And I wouldn't say that's true either. To know the child is to see where they need structure, where they need guidance, where they need boundaries, but that's according to who that child is. And so you serve them in that way. You formulate the structures and the boundaries and the guidance that they need according to who they are, as opposed to putting those boundaries and structures in place out of your own anxiety about, what you need to do to mold them into the person you think they should be.
Say yes, I definitely agree with that. And I know that you said you were kind of limited on time, so I want to make sure that we get you out of here before I end up taking too much of your time. But we unfortunately didn't get to any of your paranormal experiences or any of your UFO stuff. So hopefully at some point you'll be interested in coming back for a round two. This conversation kind of took a hold of its own, so I didn't want to throw any of the UFO stuff into that. So hopefully at some point we can come back and we can do a specific conversation on all of your UFO research and your paranormal experiences.
Yeah, I would love that. I'm totally down. Let's do it.
Hold on tight, guys. This is our last break, so stay tuned. And we are back to the show, so let's hop right in. But before we completely wrap up the show, I always like to end the show with some words of wisdom. So if there is any words of wisdom that you might want to bestow on the listeners today, what might it be?
Now that I've had a chance to explain the cognitive battle space that you live in, and that you are constantly saturated by narratives of all types that are seeking to use repetition to get your attention and seeking to manipulate your perception and then gain access to your thinking and your beliefs and your memories. Understanding all of that, I will say that the primary tool that I have utilized to gain perspective and to protect myself is the capacity to have a silent mind. It's the ability to generate internal stillness and internal silence, because that cannot be conditioned. silent cognition cannot be conditioned by narratives. So the ability to cultivate silent cognition, I think, is probably one of the most powerful tools you could cultivate for yourself, and also learn to cultivate or teach your children to cultivate in themselves. This is a very cognitive series of threats that surrounds us on a daily basis. And that to me is such a great tool. It's just the best.
Then at that point too, you won't be destroyed by your thoughts because you'll actually be able to separate yourself from them, because that seems to be one of the hardest issues in today's society, is that most people don't want to deal with their problems directly head on. They end up sitting with them and they end up screwing around in their head all day, and they just continuously get worse from overthinking. If people had the ability to just separate themselves from them for a little bit, then you could have that new profound perspective on these things when you're not directly in the center of them, and you might actually be able to come to terms with a lot of these things. But I think it's one of the hardest things for people, but it's desperately one of the things that people need the most.
There's a really funny comparison you can make, because we talked a lot about influence today, and you have, a new world order agenda that's using all this neo-Marxism, and, the neo-Marxism is in the schools and in the media, and there's all this influence and all this stuff. And they're using narratives. Okay. They're using stories. But you'll notice, if you take the time to become mindful, to become still, to become silent, you'll notice that actually anxiety and all the internal dialogue that tends to wrap you up in states of stress actually uses the same thing. It uses the same tactics that all this propaganda and psychological influence does. Your anxiety relies on stories, on very specific stories that have a very specific beginning, a very specific middle, a very specific end. So if you learn to understand that watching the mind is really just watching stories, whether you're trying to remove yourself from influence in the world and propaganda around you, or whether you're trying to understand how to get more space from your own anxiety, from your own thoughts, that really is a great way to understand it. That it's really, in the end, it's all just story based, and just learn to hold stories more lightly. And I think that's a good first step.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree with that. And with all of your fascinating research, if anybody wanted to come and possibly find any of your films that you work on, or any of the many projects you work on, where can people come and find you across the internet? And where might people even be able to contact you if they wanted to possibly even get some more information on how you homeschool, or how you unschool?
Sure. Yes, absolutely. So you can go to SimonEsler.com. That has all my work. So that has my feature-length documentary, Cut, Daughters of the West, which is a deep dive into how culture has participated in the demoralization of the West in a way that has specifically harmed girls, teenage girls, preteen girls. And it's a very, very broad view into how that has played out historically into modern times. You also have my 6-part docuseries, Superorganism, and that is a 6-part docuseries on the war on the family. And a lot of what we talked about today, and going deep into some research that exposes the warfare operations targeting the family, and some of the ideas around family that I believe could help protect and defend it. And there's also my Legacy Keepers workbook. You can get that for free. And that's a questionnaire for parents that is a way of framing your child using the hero's journey, understanding your child through the lens of the hero's journey, so that you have a tool to be able to create rites of passage that are true to who your child is. So that is, there's an actual, I think, a course on there, or just a video you can watch that orients you to my research in that area. And then you can download the free PDF on that. So that's SimonEsler.com. You can follow me on Instagram, where I'm, I think, pretty active, most active. I'm also on X. Instagram, I'm Simon_Esler1111. Instagram, it's Simon Esler. I've got tons you can check out on my Substack. You can look up Simon Esler or Subversive Clarity to check out my work there. And yeah, I think that's it.
Well, I'll make sure I include all those links down in the show description so everybody can find them quick and easy. And I appreciate you making the time to come on today, man. It was definitely a thought-provoking, fascinating conversation. And I'm really looking forward to next time diving into something a little bit different, and diving into some of your paranormal experiences and your UFO stuff.
Yeah, that'd be great. I really enjoyed the conversation as well. It was just, it was very, very rich. I really appreciate it.
If anyone would like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys can get a hold of me through social media. Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok are the ones that I'm the most active on. Or you guys can also get a hold of me through the submission form, which is available up at the top of the link tree. And the last way you guys get a hold of me is by calling or texting the Bizarre Reality Media hotline. You guys can call or text that 24/7, and that number is 313-364-1551. And if you happen to miss any of that, all of it is available down in the show description and off of the link tree. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Hope today's show is connecting some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with a mic talking about philosophy. Well, Bigfoot is stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead like a necromancer. There's so many questions and not enough answers. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune in and listen to Inquiries of Our Reality. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune